Welcome everybody. Good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you are at the moment. So this is a seminar organized within the project, the EU-funded project INCITE-DEM, Inclusive Citizenship in a World in Transformation, Co-Designing for Democracy. This is a project funded by the program Horizon Europe and coordinated by the School of Sciences at the University of Lisbon. And today, José, João, and I are going to share with you the main highlights that we found from the historical review, which was one of the goals, one of the objectives of this project. And so maybe we can start sharing the presentation. José, would you like to share the presentation? So I'm going to start and then give the floor to my colleagues, João and José. Yeah, great. So today we're going to present the highlights from the historical review. And next slide. Thank you. So as you can see, the consortium of this project is composed of different organizations, including universities, but also small and medium enterprises and NGOs. Next slide, please. At the Institute of Social Sciences of the University of Lisbon, we were in charge of one of the 7 objectives of this project, which was the production of a systemic historical review, which is the thing that we're going to present today, actually. But as you can see, the primary goal of this project is broader than that, and actually regards the study and promotion of democratic innovations for sustainability, but also a goal related to the promotion of good practices of citizen participation and a healthy relation between citizens and representative institutions. This goal was unpacked across 7 objectives. One is historical review, as I said. The second goal was understanding the key conditions for participation, which was based on an analysis of current social trends in Europe. The third goal was the creation of a dialogue tool, which involves a policy dialogue with policymakers, educators, students, and also with a focus on different democratic initiatives. The fourth goal has to do, with implementation of democracy labs, which were co-creation events organized in different cities in Europe, aimed at engaging citizens in proposing different kinds of democratic innovation. The fifth goal was the evaluation of the proposals made by citizens in the democracy labs. The sixth goal is about the creation of a policy guidance and roadmap to strengthen the political participation and civic engagement in Europe. And then last, this project is also keen to set out a community of practice. So engaging different citizens as stakeholders to spread the messages of the project. Next slide, please. So in the historical review, we started from the acknowledgement that there has been a growth in the debate about different forms of citizen participation and deliberation, all of them affecting or attempting to affect policy and decision-making in representative democracy. And what we found, and what's also one of the starting points of this project, is that we know even less about the role of these different forms of citizen participation and deliberation for environmental and social sustainability. So this historical review had to do with the trajectories of democratic innovation and their role to promote environmental and social sustainability. To do that, we decided to focus on three main groups of democratic innovations, and I will say more in the next slides. But let me already say that these are participatory budgeting, deliberative mini-publics, and a wider group of collaborative and participatory governance initiatives. Very important to say that this historical review wanted to provide the setting of how these democratic innovations have evolved in Europe since the aftermath of the Second World War to today. Next slide, please. And theory-wise, we started from understanding political participation and civic engagement in policy and decision-making can actually be captured by a theory, a set of theories around the so-called democratic innovations. However, I mean, this concept has been, of course, of help for us because we needed to somehow provide clear contours to the historical review. But on the other hand, we also acknowledge how this term is often used in ambiguous ways. So we needed to also go in depth into the way the concept was used by scholars in the literature review. And likewise, we also acknowledge that the concept of sustainability relies on degrees of uncertainty and also, in some cases, also ambiguity. So that's the reason why we decided to use as a strong reference to categorize our findings the Sustainable Development Goals. Next slide. And so let me give you a brief overview of what we did for this historical review. So first, let me say that this is most probably the very first comprehensive historical review of this kind, focusing on environmental and social sustainability in Europe. And method-wise, what we did was a combination of different kinds of approaches. The first one, and also to kind of kick off the review, we unfolded an exploratory review of seminal academic literature, and which was followed by three complementary scoping reviews. Each one of these reviews focused on a specific group of democratic innovation. So one about participatory budgeting and sustainability, the second on deliberative mini-publics and sustainability, and the third related to participatory and collaborative governance and sustainability. So together, the exploratory review and the scoping reviews wanted to trace the evolution and the trajectories of democratic innovations. In addition to that, we also interviewed 18 international experts, mostly leading scholars in this field of study. And we also complemented our findings through an archival research on historical practices in 9 European countries. And this was done by taking advantage of our colleagues in the consortium who helped us to collect information in each of the 9 countries. Next slide, please. So now let me say a couple of words on the 3 main groups of democratic innovations we have focused on. So the first one is participatory budgeting. For those of you who are not familiar with this concept and this practice, participatory budgeting dates back to the late 80s. The first experience, which was labeled as participatory budget, was in Porto Alegre in Brazil. And then after that, during the 90s and the 2000s, participatory budgeting actually gained international momentum in Latin America and Europe, but also beyond. The second group is deliberative mini-publics, and this group of democratic innovations is based on the constitution of relatively small groups of citizens who are recruited through sortition The first evidence that we have in Europe about the implementation of mini publics is in Germany during the 70s and the 80s, then followed by other kinds of mini publics like also by Fishkin, but also the citizens' assemblies starting in the early 2000s in British Columbia. And then the third category, which was, let me say, also the trickiest one to unpack, actually joins together a number of initiatives that vary in terms of approaches, but also policy areas. And so we use this label of participatory and collaborative governance, trying to make sense of this variety of practices. In the literature, participatory and collaborative governance is understood as those forms of citizen engagement in decision making, which particularly focused on the enhancement of transparency and accountability. So giving primacy to the role of governance, and then during the 2000s also increasingly including digital tools. Next slide, please. And now, in terms of, in operational terms, what did we do? We, according to the exploratory review, we created this working definition, the working definition of democratic innovations, which helped us to limit a bit the review of the scientific literature. So we had to make some choices also on what we wanted to report in this project. So this working definition is a sort of a Frankenstein, let's say so, which puts together the main inputs shared by scholars about when they define democratic innovations. So what we understand as democratic innovations is the set of institutions and processes that employ deliberative and participatory approaches to increase and diversify the participation of citizens throughout the policy cycle. And their goal is to improve the quality of democracy by addressing specific contextual deficits. But let me say, next slide, please. Let me say that this working definition is useful on the one hand, but should be taken with some care. Why? Because first, the very concept of democratic innovations, which was proposed in 2009 by Grahamson, is a concept that is useful to pull together different kinds of practices, but actually those practices already existed before the introduction of this new concept. So when we do an historical review, we have to be very careful in the way we include practices within democratic innovations. And then there is also another point that we want to raise in this in the way we worked the historical review, which is the decision that we made to focus on 3 different groups of democratic innovations is, of course, a limited choice. Actually, whenever we want to classify the wide array of forms of citizen participation and deliberation, we necessarily end up excluding something. And this is also and this point is also acknowledged by other scholars. In this slide, as you can see, we put together a couple of quotations from the interviews that we had with the international experts, which helped also raise this point. So next slide is now giving you a bit of a flavor of what we found, and then I give the stage to my colleagues, João and José. Just let me say that we can try to make sense of the evolution of democratic innovations in Europe in 4 main stages, in 4 main waves. So the first one during the 60s and 70s, a surge of social and political movements which called for deeper democratization. This was the time after the Second World War that in many cases meant to rebuild democracy. So these ideals for participation were pushed forward by both the grassroots movements, but also by the institutions themselves, which were keen to open the decision-making to citizens. Then during the 80s and the 90s, we have the Global South introducing these new practices of participation, like participatory budgeting. But interestingly, at the same time, also the Global North experimenting with new practices, especially in the case of deliberative practices. Actually, this was the time when scholars also acknowledge the so-called deliberative term. So in this time, there was a growing acknowledgement of the deliberative principles as useful to reinforce the debate about how to improve democracy. During the during the 2000s, we see a growth in the scholarship and the overall interest around democratic innovations. And this interest was coupled by the efforts to typify the different practices that were being implemented. And then in the last decade, this trend has continued. So this boost in the scholarship has embraced more and more the wide complexity within these sort of practices, including also the growth of in the use of digital and hybrid formats, for example, but also in the way in which grassroots groups and movements, citizens, can have the lead of these sort of innovations. Let us stress also that more and more the focus is less on the practices per se, so there is also an attempt to go beyond a silo approach to democratic innovations, and there is a growing interest in the way these innovations work within the systems, which means also to look at the way the innovations are embedded within the public machinery. So that said, let me just finish this part saying that we published 2 reports from this historical review. Both are publicly available on ZENODO. The first report is about the literature review that we made on democratic innovation from the Second World War to today, with a focus on sustainability in Europe. And the second report is an original database on democratic innovations in Europe, again, from the Second World War to today. And about the database, let me give the floor to João.
Thanks, Roberto. So let's move on to the next slide. Please, yeah. So as Roberto mentioned, part of our work at the INCITE-DEM project encompassed this collection of real-world examples of democratic innovation to create a database for, because there's a general consensus in the field that that we lack systematized knowledge, coherent sort of data sets, etc., that enable us to form generalizations about how these democratic innovations are designed, how they are integrated into the wider system, how they interact with other forms of participation, etc. So there's this consensus that there's this lack of methodological tools, and one of the aspects that our project wanted to address was basically to help fill this research gap. So what we did was we collected information about democratic innovation, so participatory budgeting, initiatives, deliberative mini-publics, etc. And we relied on data sources or other data sources which are open access, where everyone can sort of access them and see them and check the information for themselves, but they were not pooled together into a larger data set. So these sources that we relied upon were Participedia, which is a very well-known sort of Wikipedia-like platform where people in authorities, institutions, etc., can kind of upload information on specific practices, and then there's like a curating system that sort of ensures the quality of the information. We also relied on the OECD's dataset of deliberative practices, CNOCA's dataset, the G1000 datasets, and also the IOPD dataset. And we basically pulled them together. After this exercise, we ended up with over 1,000 individual cases of democratic innovations. So each case was like a specific participatory budgeting initiative or a specific mini-public that happened in a specific place in a specific time. And then we classified each of these democratic innovations, each of these cases, in different variables. So we classified according to the type of democratic innovation, as Roberto mentioned before. We identified these three main typologies, three main types: participatory budgeting, deliberative mini-publics, and also this sort of hazier, more diffuse format that we call participatory and collective governance. We also collect the data on the country and the locality where they took place, as well as the time where the process was initiated, the specific year. We collect the data on the number of participants that these democratic innovations invited and engaged with, number of citizens, basically. We also collect the data on the duration of the process that we operationalized as a number of meetings. So, for instance, democratic innovation that took place in two consecutive weekends would have 2 meetings and not 2 weeks of duration. We also collect the data on the level of governance, and by this we mean where in the administrative system these democratic innovations took place. They could take place in the local level, at the regional level, at the national level, but also at the transnational or international level. And finally, we collect the data on the policy area. So what specific policy field, environment, planning, etc., the innovation tackled, for instance. Can we move on to the next slide, please? So what does this all mean at the end of the day, this exercise of collecting data and sort of pooling together data from different sources? We basically created a lot of graphics, figures, that enable us to have a kind of a bird's eye view of the field of democratic innovations. In terms of the timeline of implementation of democratic innovations, we can find a relatively broad time period. So we find a kind of a beginning of experimentation in the late 70s, as Roberto already mentioned, with initiatives such as the planning cells, which is a kind of deliberative mini-public format in Germany. And we see a progressive adoption or rate of adoption across time with multiple types of democratic innovations. But overall, you can see that you have a first phase of the process, which you could say goes from the late 80s to the early 2000s, where deliberative mini-publics were very important, and we here are talking about planning cells. We're talking about the consensus conferences that were developed by the Danish Board of Technology, for instance. After the 2000s, we see diversification with the arrival in Europe of participatory budgeting, and which increases over time, although unlike mini publics, which become increasingly popular over time, participatory budgeting kind of has these sort of wave patterns, right? There's a high interest in the sort of mid 2000s, early 2010s, but then it kind of dies out a bit. And on the other hand, deliberative mini publics are very popular. And this, obviously is based on the very important cases and the celebrity of very important cases, such as the Irish Constitutional Convention, the wave of climate assemblies, etc. But relatively speaking, there's an increasing interest and rate of adoption of democratic innovations across time in Europe. Next slide, please. When it comes to the geographical dispersion of these initiatives, we found through our research that they are very uneven, right? So we have these cluster of countries where we can see different rates of adoption. So we have a kind of a high adoption cluster that is formed by the United Kingdom, which is by far the country in our database with the most democratic innovations implemented. But you also have countries like Germany and countries like Italy. And these countries display a very distribution across types. So it's mostly mini publics, but there's also participatory budgeting initiatives. There's also participatory and collaborative governance initiatives in this country. Then you have a kind of a mid-range cluster, which is formed by countries like Spain, by France, by Belgium, Austria, Denmark, Netherlands. And here you see specifically a high rate of adoption of mini publics, more so than other forms of democratic innovation. Then you have a lower cluster of adoption, which is formed by countries like Portugal, Poland, Sweden, Norway, Finland, for instance, and also Eastern and Central European countries. So as you can see, you can't really pin down a specific pattern, geographical pattern, right? You have on the low range cluster, you have Southern European countries, but you also have Nordic countries, right? And you also have Eastern European countries. So the map is highly uneven, and we can have some clues about that explain why this is the case. But and we think that it probably relates to things like administrative capacity. So are the institutions capable of implementing processes like these, for instance? The development of civil society, etc., etc. But it's hard to do any kind of exercise of pattern recognition because the countries are very varied, right? But I must note that, and this is something that we mention a lot in our deliverables, in the research that we have done, since we don't have systematic knowledge or knowledge collection tools on these participatory and deliberative practices, there's also this gap, right? Is it really a question of rate of adoption, or is it a question of archival capacity, right? So it's hard to untangle which one is the two. It's probably both working in tandem. So next slide, please. So regarding the formats of democratic innovation, we find that by far the most popular one, or at least the most archived one, is deliberative mini publics, with a rate of adoption of over 600 cases across many geographies of Europe, right? So it's not just Western Europe, it's not just Nordic Europe, it's also Southern Europe, etc. We also find less than half of the cases of participatory and collaborative governance. And trailing behind a bit, participatory budgeting, right? But this, as we saw in the timeline, we can kind of see these patterns across time, but you can also see them in the absolute. So participatory budgeting became popular, but didn't really take off in the same way as deliberative mini publics. And in the deliverables, in the reports, we kind of talk about why this might be the case, and maybe we can sort of answer some questions if the people watching are interested on why we think, what are the reasons behind the sort of different patterns. Moving on to the next slide, please. Regarding the scales of governance, we see a kind of an interesting pyramid, if you will, in the data, right? So by far the most the scale of governance, which is more adept at implementing these democratic innovations, is the local scale, right? And we can explain this with some degree of certainty, right? I mean, it's the scale of governance which is closer to citizens. It's easier to implement these processes because of things like subsidiarity. They probably are less expensive because they don't involve as many people, etc., and not in such a wider scope. So it's easy to justify this. And as we move up in the pyramid, we find that the next level is the regional level, probably for the same reasons. Then we have the national scale, and trailing behind, we have transnational and supranational scale as a kind of a setting for democratic innovations. But by far, the most sort of popular scale where democratic innovations take place is the local level. Moving on to the next slide, please. Regarding the patterns of citizen engagement, i.e. the number of citizens involved in these practices, we also find that they tend to be shorter in scale, right? So they tend to involve less citizens rather than more citizens. So the way that we operationalize this, we kind of broke down. We created these categories of intervals, as you can see in the graphic, and the movement is regressive in the sense that the first interval of citizens, which goes from 1 to 50 citizens, is by far the most sort of popular, and it kind of trickles down from there. There's some interesting patterns. For instance, participatory budgeting tends in general to involve more people, more citizens than other forms of democratic innovations, while deliberative mini publics they kind of fill this mid-range gap of like 50 to 100 citizens, 1 to 50 citizens. And then participatory and collaborative governance tends to occupy the first bracket, 1 to 50 citizens. And this is easy to understand and interpret because participatory governance usually involves like specific stakeholders that have a stake, if you will, in the specific domain of policy area that is being sort of engaged with. But yeah, so overall, democratic innovations tend to involve less citizens than more citizens, and this can bring about issues of representativeness, inclusion, etc., that practitioners need to be aware of. Move on to the next slide, please, which concerns the duration of these participatory and deliberative processes. What we find is basically the same pattern, but here the skewedness towards short-term engagement is even more so than skewedness towards less citizens. So we find that most democratic innovations tend to involve citizens during up to 1 and 10 meetings each, right? We also have instances in the data set of broader engagements in terms of time, but the overwhelming pattern is short-term engagement, and this also has interesting implications for for instance, for the embeddedness of these processes in policy making processes, for instance, a certain degree of, one could say, tokenism maybe in these engagements. So, yeah, broadly speaking, short-term engagement over long-term engagement in terms of democratic innovations in Europe. And finally, regarding the policy areas where democratic innovations are mostly sort of applied in, we find that overwhelmingly they are applied in planning and development, i.e., urban design, things like urban design, things like land use, things like infrastructure development, for instance. So democratic innovations, which makes sense given the scale where these innovations are applied, right? So we saw in the earlier graph that a lot of these democratic innovations occurred at the local level. And if you think about it, a lot of these policy areas are local area or tend to be local level policy areas, such as planning and development, environment, probably not so much, but also the local level has a high salient intervention in this specific policy area. And you also find this interesting finding, which is this category which we could label as governance and political institutions. So what does this mean? It means that sometimes, and quite a few times actually, these innovations are applied as a kind of a meta tool, right? They are applied to increase the quality of governance, increase citizen engagement, increase the quality of democracy, for instance. So they are not engaging with specific problems of urban design or specific environmental issues or welfare policies, but they are engaging with this kind of meta level where the tools are being used to increase in democratic engagement and qualify democratic engagement. So yeah, broadly speaking, this is the broader view, bird's eye view of the real world cases of democratic innovation, and I obviously invite everyone to go and have a look at our deliverable. Yeah, thank you. And now I guess the floor is José's. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, João. So as Roberto said earlier, we produced two reports, one with this focus that João just presented some highlights, like about real practices of democratic innovations, and another one that looks to what has been produced from a scholarly point of view about democratic innovations with a specific focus. Though we did not look at what has been produced about democratic innovations in general terms, but so we questioned how these innovations contributed or how do they relate to sustainability. And by sustainability, we do not just mean environmental goals like biodiversity or climate action, but also equity, inclusion, social cohesion, that tends to be more related with social sustainability. So we know that democratic innovations, like those three main groups that we have presented so far, mini publics, participatory budgeting, collaborative participatory governance, have grown in numbers across Europe. João has shown that. But then we asked how these innovations are really contributing to sustainability. So that was this goal, was one of the main goals of this report. In terms of the methodology, we followed through a protocol for a systematic literature review, one directed to the relationship between democratic innovations and environmental sustainability, and another one for democratic innovations and the relationship with social sustainability. So we started by identifying over 2,300 peer-reviewed articles overall from the Social Science Citation Index. So we basically looked at we did the search on the Web of Science platform. using crafted, directed keywords that combined democratic innovations and sustainability themes. We then filtered those based on strict criteria. For instance, the article had to mention both democratic innovation and sustainability in the title, in the abstract, or on the keywords. And after running the different exclusion criteria, we ended up with the final pool of 347 articles on social sustainability and 345 on environmental sustainability, which were then coded, each of the article, by type of democratic innovation. So if the articles focus on participatory budgeting on a type of media public, about the sustainability focus, if it was more on sustainability, social sustainability issues or environmental sustainability, the geographical region, the research method. So we had a clear map of what we know, where are the gaps, and how the research has evolved through time. Starting with some overall view about what we collect in terms of scholarly production of democratic innovations and environmental sustainability. Regarding the publications through time, the view of publications through time, it really matches in a way what João has said about the real practices. When you look at the data over time, we see that the research about democratic innovations and environmental sustainability, it's quite recent. At least of course the peer-reviewed articles we were able to collect, which does not mean that it's what it exists in reality, which is the same for the real world practices, but with most publications appearing after the early 2000s and peaking in the last decade. Geographically, although this work had a focus on Europe, we also collected research from the other regions in the world. We still see that the bulk of research is concentrated in Europe. I need to say that we coded this not about the region of the author, so where the author is located, to where he published this, but the focus of the publication. Followed by Oceania, South America, where countries like, we know that from the historical review, countries like Australia and Brazil have pioneered some key innovations like mini publics and participatory budgeting in the case of Brazil. There's some limited research from Africa and parts of Asia, and and I will pass to the next slide. Then we had a more specific focus. As Roberto mentioned in one of the earlier slides, although subject to criticism, we have used the Sustainable Development Goals to have a more refined analysis on how democratic innovations relate to environmental sustainability and also social sustainability. So what we did was we also coded this different research, this different pool of research we collected in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals. In this case, the Sustainable Development Goals that deal with, or that directly express themes and topics related with environmental sustainability, such as climate action, life on land, clean water, clean energy, but also responsible consumption and production. And in terms of trends, we see that the most frequent ones are climate action, life on land, also responsible consumption and production, which tell us that democratic innovations in this area of environmental sustainability are most often linked with issues like climate policy, biodiversity conservation, and sustainable resource use. Others, such as clean water, clean energy, are less commonly addressed, at least judging by the pool of research we have collected. Just to give you some examples, things that were collected in terms of climate action are citizen assemblies on climate. Things that were coded as in terms of life on land are, for example, participatory budgeting whose funding decisions relate to protection of urban green areas, peri-urban ecosystems, urban planning with biodiversity concerns, and finally, things that we coded in terms of the CDG 12 responsible consumption production deal with things like sustainable food systems policy, food policy councils both in urban areas and in rural areas. We then also looked, and this is from an article that we have published recently. We have also looked in a deeper way the sort of main policy domains that emerge when we look at the research from each type of democratic innovations, and we saw that from deliberative mini publics. They are research about them in this overall theme of environmental sustainability is about influencing policies by engaging citizens and experts for informed environmental policy making and governance on climate change. In terms of PB, was more about funding projects on climate action and climate justice by aligning them with local communities' priorities and local government agendas. Within the context, for example, of the Agenda 21. And finally, participatory governance quite emphasizes the importance of engagement of local actors for environmental policy making in the field of biodiversity conservation and collaborative governance with this multi-stakeholder management about natural resources. In terms of the findings that we have, we would emphasize that it's quite visible that DIs have improved at some extent the inclusion and the quality of deliberation, but their environmental impact is less systematically assessed and varies significantly across cases and geographies. Also that the potential of democratic innovations to contribute to environmental sustainability is often assumed rather than demonstrate. There's sort of a stronger focus on procedures rather than outcomes. And we also argue that there's the need to go beyond procedural measures and evaluate how the democratic innovations shape actual policy decisions, implementation, and therefore transformative change in terms of environmental sustainability. Passing now to democratic innovations and social sustainability. Same trend in terms of the research we collected over time. You know, there's this initial pool of research starting to pick up in the beginning of 2000s, but then really gets more trendy over the last definitely in the last decade, but over the last few years. And also the same trend in terms of research across the globe. Not really much difference, I would say. Perhaps I would highlight that obviously we collected more research in terms of participatory budgeting in South America than we did for environmental sustainability. This is also related with the fact that participatory budgeting being more on issues related with redistributive policies, at least originally, and this happens usually or more often in urban settings than in urban settings and with policies related with social cohesion, social justice, rather than issues on climate, biodiversity conservation. That's why you see it more in terms of social sustainability. In terms of the analysis of publications distribution in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals that we assumed as Sustainable Development Goals more related with social sustainability. The most common ones are sustainable cities and communities, reduced inequalities, peace, just and strong institutions. And to just give some few examples for each of them. For example, for the Sustainable Development Goal 11, sustainable cities and communities, it's about things like allocation of public funds for issues like housing, mobility, and the improvement of public space. For CDG 10, reduced inequalities, deliberative processes that specifically try to include underrepresented groups such as migrants, people with disabilities, and these have been implemented in places like Barcelona or Bologna. We have research about this, also cases, by the way, on the database about this. And finally, about Sustainable Development Goal 16, peace, justice, and strong institutions are about things like research on citizen juries in countries like Italy or UK, that they were commissioned to increase accountability, transparency, and institutional trust, particularly in the delivery of public services like national healthcare systems. In terms of key findings, the findings really suggest that democratic innovations can significantly enhance social sustainability when well designed and contextually embedded. João mentioned about this embeddedness. They contribute to fostering inclusive participation, especially at the local level, empowering affected communities, strengthening civic capacities, but also improving collective learning and co-creation of public policies. However, there are also some important limitations. We found several recurring limitations when analyzing scholarly production. That first of all, fragmentation. Democratic innovations are often disconnected from broader governance systems. So there's this problem of upscaling or even dialoguing with upper scales of governance. Underrepresentation of affected communities. It's a quite known fact and proven by the literature that there's a lot of self-selection bias in this deliberative and participatory practices, the limited capacity to address root causes of social inequality and exclusion, and of course also weak monitoring and follow-up mechanisms that prevent long-term impact. Yeah, I will now give back the word to Roberto for the concluding remarks.
Yeah. So, well, I mean, just very briefly to say that what we found from this historical review is that actually democratic innovations can have a role in enhancing the legitimacy of democratic systems. They need to really improve the feedback loop between the institutions and citizens that take part to this kind of practices. And but most importantly, also considering the history of some of these practices, let me stress maybe more participatory budgeting and participatory governance, goals of social inclusion, goals related to social redistribution of economic resources and equity are of utmost importance for this kind of practices. And this, of course, also leads to the wider debate on how these practices can be institutionalized within the existing institutions and also within the mainstream policy making. Next slide. So considering the setbacks and considering the main findings, what can we do in terms of for the future of these practices? We think that there are some points that we would like to stress. One is, as I said, a stronger embeddedness of democratic innovations within the governance systems. This would ensure more durable and more continuous practices. The second point is linked, as I said, to policies that enhance also the inclusion of the most vulnerable groups in the society, which would minimize at least power asymmetries within society. And then the last point, which is a point that I like to stress always whenever I present about participation, is to really make an investment on the monitoring and evaluation of these practices. This is the only way we can really learn from what we are doing. This is the only way we think we can really improve on an evidence-based knowledge what we are doing in terms of participation, if we want to strengthen the link between participation and policy. And I think it's all. And maybe we want to, this is a list of publications that we have either published or we are going to publish very soon. And all of them try to make sense of this work that we have done in the last couple of years related to the historical review. And you're very welcome to access this publication in case you think it's useful for you, but also to get in touch with us in case you want to know more. And then here you have our emails, addresses. So please feel free to email us in case you want to know more about the project and about our work. Thank you very much.